I have stood at the old harbours of Western Ireland, where the wind still carries salt off the Atlantic, and I have read the shipping records that almost nobody talks about. In the single year of 1847, while roughly 400,000 people in Ireland starved to death, close to 4,000 ships sailed out of those same harbours loaded with food. Butter by the 100,000 gallons. Live cattle, oats, peas, honey, salmon, porter and whiskey by the 1,000,000 gallons. Much of it left under armed military escort, past the bodies lying in the ditches, past children with the swollen bellies of the starving. The Irish would later give that year its own name. They called it Black 47, and the crop at the center of all of it, the crop whose failure hollowed out an entire nation in less than a decade, was a lumpy, dirt-covered root that most of Europe had refused to even eat just 100 years earlier. That is where most tellings of this story begin, and it is also where most of them stop. A blight, a famine, a tragedy. But that is one chapter near the end of a much longer book, and it leaves out almost everything that actually matters. Because the true story of the potato runs for more than 8,000 years. It begins with a poison growing wild above the clouds. It runs through an empire that freeze-dried its food without electricity, through kings who weaponized this crop and hid it underground from invading armies, through 9 scientists who chose to starve to death rather than eat the seeds they were guarding, and it ends with the first crop that human beings are seriously trying to grow on the surface of Mars. So stay with me, because we are going to follow this single route across 8,000 years and across nearly every continent on the planet. We will climb a mountain in South America, watch an empire rise and fall, sit at a French dinner party that changed history, walk through the worst famine of the 19th century, and stand inside a besieged city where men died guarding a vault of seeds. 9 stops in total. I will tell you where we are at every one of them. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand why a vegetable that was once blamed for leprosy and called the food of the devil is now considered humanity's best hope for feeding a colony on another world. Let us begin where the potato itself began, high in the mountains. Our first stop is the Andes, roughly 8,000 years ago. Picture the high plateau of what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, above 12,000 feet, above the cloud line, where the air is thin and the nights are brutally cold. Scattered across that rocky, windswept ground grew wild potato plants. They were nothing like the smooth, golden potatoes you know. They were small, some no larger than a marble, and they were genuinely poisonous. Wild potatoes produce defensive compounds called glycoalkaloids, chiefly solanine and chaconine, and eating them raw causes burning, cramps, vomiting, and in a high enough dose, death. The people living in those mountains learned this the hard way, over generations of trial and error and loss. But they also learned something far more impressive, and this is the first moment in our story where you should stop thinking of these as primitive people. They discovered that if you soaked these bitter wild tubers in cold, running mountain streams for several days, the water would leach out much of the poison. Then, if you exposed them to the freeze of the high-altitude night and the thaw of the equatorial day, over and over, you could break down what remained and make the things safe. This was applied chemistry, carried out by farmers who had no word for chemistry. And then, across thousands of years, by carefully replanting only the mildest and least bitter tubers, generation after generation, they slowly bred the poison out and the starch in. They had no concept of genetics. They were doing genetics anyway, by hand, one harvest at a time. By the time the Inca Empire rose to dominate the western spine of South America in the 1400s, the potato had become something extraordinary. On terraced fields carved into impossibly steep slopes around Cusco, Inca farmers cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties. Yellow, purple, red, blue, some so dark they were nearly black, in shapes from perfectly round to gnarled and twisted. Each variety was matched to a specific altitude, a specific soil, a specific pocket of climate on the mountainside. This was not casual farming. This was a vast agricultural science, and on top of it, the Inca built one of the largest empires the Americas had ever seen. That brings us to our second stop, and to my favorite piece of engineering in this entire story. The Inca faced a problem that would defeat European farmers for centuries afterward. Fresh potatoes rot. In a world with no refrigeration, that is a fatal weakness for any food you want to store or carry. The Inca solution was a frozen, foot-powered miracle called Chuño. At elevations above 12,000 feet, in the bitter cold of June and July, families would spread their potatoes on the ground and let them freeze solid through the night. The next day, under the intense mountain sun, they would walk across them barefoot, crushing them and squeezing out the water with their own feet. They repeated this freeze and thaw and stomp for several nights. What remained was a light, chalky, bone-dry nugget that weighed almost nothing and could be stored for up to 10 years without spoiling. Now think about what that actually is. By freezing a food solid and then letting the ice escape as vapor in the dry mountain air, the Inca were performing freeze-drying. They had stumbled onto sublimation, the process where a solid passes directly into gas without ever becoming liquid, centuries before any European laboratory described it. The same fundamental process is now called lyophilization, and it is how the modern world preserves vaccines, antibiotics, blood plasma, and the instant coffee in your kitchen. A barefoot farmer in the Andes was running the same physics that keeps a flu vaccine stable today. The viewers who told me the Inca were farming wizards were not exaggerating. If anything, they were underselling it. And Chuño did more than feed families. It fed the empire. Inca armies marched on it because it was light, it would not spoil, and it carried enormous calories. It was stored by the ton in state warehouses as insurance against bad years, and it functioned almost like a currency, a taxable surplus that gave the state real power. Here is the part that connects this mountain food to the wider world. After the Spanish conquered the Andes, they kept Chuño in production for a brutal new purpose. They fed it to the indigenous laborers worked to death in the silver mines of Potosi. And the silver that poured out of Potosi is what bankrolled the Spanish Empire for 2 centuries. So this humble, foot-stomped, freeze-dried potato helped power the flow of silver that reshaped the entire global economy. Hold that thought, because the irony of what the Spanish did next is hard to overstate. That is our third stop. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, they were hunting gold and silver, and they found staggering amounts of both. What they barely noticed was the ugly little tuber the conquered people ate at nearly every meal. A few potatoes drifted back to Spain around 1570. We can actually date the first documented European consumption with real precision, and it kills one of the most popular myths about the potato. The Hospital de la Sangre in Seville was buying potatoes to feed its patients starting in 1573. That is 7 years before Francis Drake supposedly brought the potato to England, and it means the old stories crediting Drake or Walter Raleigh with introducing the potato are simply false. The potato reached Europe through Spain, quietly, as cheap food for sailors and the sick and the poor. And then Europe recoiled from it. To understand why, you have to understand the world it landed in. Europeans grew wheat and barley and rye, grains that rose toward the heavens in the sunlight, grains that bread was made from, bread that was treated as a gift from God. The potato grew downward, in the dark, in the dirt. It was lumpy and covered in little growths people called eyes. Worse, it belonged to the nightshade family, cousins to some of the most poisonous plants in Europe. To a deeply religious and superstitious population, that was not a coincidence, it was a warning. So the rumors spread faster than the crop ever could. In parts of Europe, the potato was blamed for causing leprosy, the gnarled tubers said to resemble the swollen limbs of the diseased. Russian Orthodox peasants called it the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin. In Scotland, some Presbyterian farmers refused to grow it on the grounds that the potato is mentioned nowhere in the Bible, and therefore God could not have intended people to eat it. That was a real theological argument made by real ministers in real churches. For nearly 200 years, the potato sat in European gardens as an oddity. Wealthy people grew it for its pretty purple flowers. The story goes that Marie Antoinette wore those blossoms in her hair at court, but actually, eating the thing on a regular basis was seen as beneath any respectable person, a mark of livestock and desperate poverty. For a long time, the potato seemed stuck there, despised and ignored, while people went hungry all around it. What finally rescued it was not good taste, it was war. That is our fourth stop, and it is where this vegetable becomes a weapon. The first leader to grasp its military value was Frederick II of Prussia. The ruler history calls Frederick the Great. He had a recurring nightmare of a problem. His kingdom kept getting invaded, and invading armies would burn the Prussian wheat fields to starve the population into surrender. Grain was easy to destroy. You set it on fire, and it was gone. But a crop that grew completely underground was a different matter entirely. An enemy army could march straight across a potato field, could even camp on it, and never know that an entire harvest of food was sitting 6 inches beneath their boots. Frederick understood that a food you could hide in the soil was a strategic asset, and beginning in the 1740s, he issued a series of orders pushing his peasants to plant potatoes. The most famous of them, in 1756, is remembered as the Potato Edict. His peasants resisted. They thought the things were fit only for animals. And here we arrive at one of the most charming stories in the whole history of food, a story that a lot of you told me you loved. As it is told, Frederick changed tactics. Instead of threatening people, he planted a royal field of potatoes and posted uniformed soldiers to guard it day and night as if it held something precious. The peasants reasoned that anything a king guards that closely must be worth stealing, and they began sneaking in at night to dig up the plants for themselves, which was supposedly exactly what Frederick wanted. I have to be honest with you, because this story is too good to leave unexamined. Historians treat the guarded garden tale as legend rather than documented fact, and almost the identical story is told about a Frenchman we are about to meet. Whether or not it happened, the underlying truth holds. Within a single generation, the potato went from livestock feed to a staple across Prussia and northern Germany. The psychology, real or invented, worked. That Frenchman is Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, and his story is genuinely documented. Parmentier was an army pharmacist who, during the 7 Years' War, was captured by the Prussians and held as a prisoner for 3 years. The food his captors gave him, meal after meal, was potatoes. He did not get leprosy. He did not lose his mind. He came out healthier than many soldiers eating the standard diet, and it made him question everything his own country believed. He spent the rest of his life on a single mission, to make France eat the potato. He won a national prize for studying it, and in 1778 he threw a series of dinners where every dish was made from potatoes, served to guests who included Benjamin Franklin and the great chemist Antoine Lavoisier. He handed bouquets of potato flowers to King Louis XVI and to Marie Antoinette, and yes, he is the man most often tied to the guarded field stunt as well. When he died, admirers planted potato plants around his grave in Paris, where they grow to this day. France slowly came around. But while France was being seduced by dinner parties, something very different was taking root across the sea, and it would end in catastrophe. We are now roughly halfway through our journey at the fifth stop, and this is where the story turns dark. Ireland in the 1700s and the 1800s was under British rule, and most of its land was owned by absentee landlords. The Catholic majority were tenant farmers, pushed onto smaller and smaller plots of poor, rocky soil, plots of 1 or 2 acres on which almost nothing else would grow well. The potato was perfect for that misery. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. It thrived in the cool, wet ground where grain failed. A family could live on potatoes and a little buttermilk and survive. And survive they did. Ireland's population exploded from around 3 million in 1700 to over 8 million by 1840. The potato made that possible, but there was a flaw built into the foundation, and any farmer who looked closely could have seen it. Almost all of Ireland's crop came from a single variety called the Irish lumper. Not many varieties. One. And because potatoes are grown from pieces of other potatoes, every lumper in Ireland was very nearly a genetic clone of every other lumper. The entire food supply of a nation of 8 million people was one genetic line, with no diversity to fall back on and no resistant strain held in reserve. The clock was ticking, and Ireland could not hear it. In the late summer of 1845, a water mold arrived, almost certainly carried on ships from the Americas. We now know its name, Phytophthora infestans, and thanks to a remarkable piece of genetic detective work, we know more than that. In 2013, scientists recovered DNA from dried potato leaves preserved in museum collections from the famine years, and they identified the exact strain that did the killing, a lineage they named Herb 1, which has since gone extinct. It thrived in precisely the cool, damp conditions that define the Irish climate. The effect was almost instant. Fields that looked healthy in the morning were a black, rotting ruin by evening. Farmers dug up their tubers and found foul-smelling pulp. The stench of decay hung over whole counties. That alone was a disaster. But what turned a disaster into an apocalypse is that the blight came back in 1846, in 1847, and again in 1848. And what the British government did in those years is the most disputed and most important part of this entire story. That is our sixth stop, and it is the one you asked me to look at hardest. The Irish do not call it the potato famine. They call it An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, and the reason is the part I opened this whole story with, because while the people starved, Ireland kept exporting food. Let me give you the documented numbers because they are extraordinary, and then I am going to be honest with you about how historians actually argue over them. According to the research of the historian Christine Keneally, in the first 9 months of Black 47 alone, Ireland exported more than 200,000 gallons of butter to Bristol and Liverpool, along with over 1 million gallons of porter, Guinness, and whiskey distilled from Irish grain. Across the famine years, more than 3 million live animals were exported, which is more than the number of people who emigrated in the same period. And a great deal of this food left from the very ports of the starving West under the protection of soldiers. The man whose name sits at the center of the blame is Sir Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official who effectively controlled famine relief. In his own published writing, he described the catastrophe as the work of Providence, a remedy for what he saw as the deeper problems of Irish society. In his letters, he called the famine the judgment of God. He shut down relief programs and pushed a brutal logic of self-reliance. And then there was the Gregory Clause of 1847, which ruled that anyone holding more than a quarter acre of land could receive no relief at all. To get food, a family first had to give up their farm, which meant landlords could clear their estates of the poor under the cover of charity. One priest of the time called it a more complete engine for the slaughter of a people than was ever designed. Somewhere around 250,000 people were evicted in the years that followed. Now, here is where I have to keep faith with you and with the facts. because the truth is more complicated than the angriest version of this story, and you deserve the real picture. Some historians, including Austin Burke, have shown that by 1847, the food being imported into Ireland, mostly cheap Indian corn, actually outweighed what was being exported. Scholars like Roy Foster and Enda Delaney argue that the exports, however grotesque in the moment, were not the main driver of the death toll. The deepest debate among historians is whether this was deliberate, something close to genocide, or a catastrophe of fanatical ideology and contempt and incompetence. What is not in dispute is the scale. Approximately 1 million people died, with serious estimates ranging from around 750,000 to 1.5 million. Another million or more fled, and many of them fled on ships so deadly they earned their own name, the coffin ships. Of the roughly 99,000 emigrants who sailed for Quebec in 1847, more than 10,000 died at sea or in quarantine. On the island of Grosse Ile in the St. Lawrence River, the quarantine station recorded over 5,000 burials in that single year. One vessel, the Virginius, carried close to 500 people, and 158 of them died on the crossing, with most of the rest arriving sick. These were the survivors of the Great Hunger, dying within sight of a new world. The diaspora they created would reshape Boston, New York, Liverpool and Melbourne, and would carry a generational anger toward British rule that fed Irish nationalism for the next 70 years. That is the human cost of one crop, one variety, and one blight. But the potato's relationship with death and survival was not finished, because in the next century, men would once again be willing to die for it. Not from it, for it. That is our 7th stop, and it is a story almost nobody knows. To tell it, we travel to the Soviet Union, to the city of Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, during the Second World War. There, a botanist named Nikolai Vavilov had built something the world had never seen, the first great seed bank, a collection of more than 180,000 plant varieties gathered from 64 countries across 5 continents, all to safeguard the future of the world's food. Vavilov himself did not live to see what happened next. He had fallen foul of Stalin, and a favored pseudo-scientist was arrested and died of starvation in a prison cell in 1943, a man who had spent his life fighting hunger, killed by it. When the German army laid siege to Leningrad, a siege that would last 872 days and kill more than 1 million people through starvation, Vavilov's staff faced an impossible choice. They were sitting inside a vault filled with food, rice, corn, beans, and tens of thousands of potato samples. And they refused to eat it because every seed they ate was a variety that might be lost to humanity forever. So they barricaded themselves in, took turns guarding the collection from starving citizens and from rats, and one by one they starved. A specialist in groundnuts named Alexander Shchukin died at his desk. A rice expert named Dmitry Ivanov died surrounded by bags of the grain he would not touch. By the end of the siege, somewhere between 9 and 12 of them had starved to death in the middle of one of the largest food collections on Earth. One of them died guarding the potatoes. I find it hard to think of a purer statement of what this crop, and the diversity behind it, was worth. That instinct to protect the potato's genetic treasure is still alive, and it has become a quiet kind of warfare. The International Potato Center in Lima, Peru, founded in 1971, now guards the world's largest potato collection, thousands of varieties, many of them frozen in liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees. Backups of these seeds sit inside the Svalbard Global Seed Vault near the North Pole. And in the Andes themselves, 6 Quechua communities run a place called the Potato Park. More than 9,000 hectares set aside to protect native varieties from corporate biopiracy, with an agreement that forbids the patenting of their ancestral potatoes. The descendants of the farmers who first tamed the poison 8,000 years ago are still standing guard over it. from a poison on a mountain to a food worth dying for. And from here, the potato does something it had never done before. It conquers the planet. That is our 8th stop, the Great Spread, and it follows the trade routes of empire. Let us start with India, because so many of you asked about it. The Portuguese brought the potato to India's western coast in the early 1600s and called it batata, a word that survives in Indian languages to this day, and which is why Mumbai's beloved street snack is the batata vada. For a long time it stayed a curiosity. Then the British East India Company seized on it, not just as food, but as ideology, promoting the potato as proof of the benefits of imperial rule, claiming it would bring a happiness to India until then unknown. Cultivation climbed into the hill stations, into Shimla and the Nilgiri Hills by around 1830. Over time, the English word potato and the Sanskrit root for an edible tuber blurred into the word Indians use today, aloo. From a Portuguese trading post to aloo gobi and Kolkata biryani, the potato wove itself so deeply into Indian cooking that most people forget it is a foreigner. Today, India is the second largest potato producer on the planet, growing over 60 million tons a year. And the largest producer of all is China, which now grows around 93 million tons a year. That is roughly 1 in every 4 potatoes on Earth. The potato reached China in the late Ming dynasty by sea, and for centuries it was minor. What changed everything was geography. In the cool, steep highlands of Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou, where rice paddies and wheat fields struggle, the potato thrives. It filled a gap nothing else could fill, and in 2015, the Chinese government formally launched a campaign to elevate the potato to a national staple food alongside rice, wheat, and corn. A quiet decision about the food security of more than 1 billion people. The crop the Spanish ignored is now a strategic pillar of the world's largest population. And in the 20th century, the potato finally became the open weapon of war that Frederick the Great had only hinted at. In both world wars, governments understood that a nation that could feed itself could keep fighting. In Britain during the Second World War, the Ministry of Food invented a cartoon mascot named Potato Pete with his own song and recipe book, urging citizens to grow and eat potatoes as a patriotic duty under the famous slogan, "Dig for Victory." In the United States, around 20 million victory gardens supplied nearly 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables. But the potato did more than feed soldiers. In the Soviet Union, industrial alcohol distilled from potatoes became a feedstock for synthetic rubber, the rubber that tires and seals an army when natural supplies are cut off. A food crop was being turned, quite literally, into the material of mechanized war. And then there is the strangest war story of all, which I will give you exactly as honestly as I can. In 1943, in the Pacific, the American destroyer USS O'Bannon found itself almost on top of a surfaced Japanese submarine, too close to depress its guns. The legend says the crew pelted the submarine with potatoes, and that the Japanese sailors mistook them for grenades and wasted precious time hurling them back overboard instead of manning their deck gun. Maine potato growers were so delighted they sent the ship a commemorative plaque. It is a wonderful story. It is also one the ship's own commander spent years trying to kill, insisting the potatoes were never actually thrown, that a cook had only joked the submarine was close enough to hit with one. So treat it as a sea story rather than gospel. But notice how naturally the potato slides into a tale of war, because by then it had been a weapon, a ration, and a strategic resource for 200 years. That brings us to our final stop, and to the payoff of this entire journey. Step back and look at what the potato did to the modern world, because the scale of it is genuinely staggering and most people have no idea. Economists at Harvard, Nathan Nunn and Nancy Cheyenne, ran the numbers, and their conservative estimate is that the introduction of the potato accounts for about 1/4 of all the growth in population and in urbanization across the Old World between 1700 and 1900. Read that again slowly. One vegetable, by feeding more people on less land, may be responsible for 1/4 of the population boom that filled the cities that powered the Industrial Revolution. The modern world was, in part, built on the potato, and the everyday scale is just as wild. The frozen French fry empire that feeds nearly every fast food chain on Earth traces back to one Idaho farmer, J.R. Simplot, who started selling frozen fries in 1953 and sealed a handshake deal with Ray Kroc of McDonald's in 1967. Within a few years, every McDonald's fry in the world was frozen, most of them a single variety, the Russet Burbank. Potato starch shows up in paper, in adhesives, in biodegradable plastics, and in the glue on the back of postage stamps. The potato chip, by the way, has its own famous origin myth, the tale of a chef named George Crumb inventing it in 1853 to spite a fussy customer in Saratoga Springs. That story is almost certainly false. Recipes for thin fried potato shavings appear in cookbooks decades earlier. But the myth survives because we love a good story about a potato, and by now you understand why. And so we arrive at the place I promised you at the very beginning. In December of 2015, the International Potato Center, working with NASA, began an experiment with a name that sounds like science fiction: Potatoes on Mars. They took soil from the Pampas de La Jolla, one of the driest, most Mars-like deserts on Earth, sealed a potato inside a small chamber that mimicked the thin carbon dioxide atmosphere and crushing low pressure of the Martian surface, and they watched to see whether it would grow. It did. The qualities that made the potato indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago, that it grows in poor mineral soil, that it produces more calories per acre than almost any grain, that it stores for years and provides a remarkable range of nutrients, are exactly the qualities that make it the leading candidate to be the first crop human beings grow on another planet. So think about the full arc of this thing. A small poisonous weed clinging to a freezing mountainside. A food, an empire freeze-dried with bare feet and fed to the miners who funded an empire. A crop Europe blamed for leprosy, called the devil's apple, and refused on the grounds that God never mentioned it. A weapon hidden underground from invading armies. A single fragile variety whose failure helped kill 1 million people and scatter a nation across the globe. A treasure that 9 scientists chose to starve to death rather than eat. The engine of 1/4 of the modern population boom. And now, the first green shoot we hope to coax out of the red soil of Mars. Not bad for a lumpy root that nobody wanted. I have spent a long time tracing the roots of the things our planet produces, the spices and the crops, following them through war and trade and human folly, and I am not sure any of them carries a stranger or a darker or a more hopeful story than this one. If this journey surprised you, and I hope it did, then do me a favor. Tell me in the comments which stop on this route hit you the hardest. The freeze-dried empire, the great hunger, or the men who starved guarding the seeds. Subscribe, because there are a great many more of these stories where this one came from, and they are not the ones you were taught in school. I will see you on the next route.